Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we're back for another podcast. As the viewer can already see, we have a split screen and we have a returning panelist, a very good friend, somebody we, majority of us inspire towards, by Hamad. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah for being here with us, taking the time out. Those that don't know, I'm going to give a quick intro and dive into the subject. And this subject is at the heart of the Ummah today. And I particularly wanted yourself, of all people, to be here because of your legal background. Correct me, Malbai, you've been practicing within the legal sector for how long?
Since 2005 now, so alhamdulillah, nearly 19 years.
19 years. And you've worked on various aspects of law, haven't you? Currently, recently litigation, you've done criminal law, you've done...
Criminal law at the very early stages.
Yes,
I think
yes.
For about 6 months I worked for the CPS.
Okay.
Then I changed into civil law. So I was practicing in family law, general civil litigation. I did a bit of immigration law.
Okay.
And then settled more towards civil and commercial law and corporate law, and continue to do that primarily. Every now and then I would take on some cases in family law just to sort of keep up with the changes in the law.
Yes.
And give myself a break away from the pressures of commercial and corporate world.
Fair enough. And viewers may also want to know that even before the Life in Law 2005, you were practicing as a pharmacist as well.
Yes.
So
for a bit.
Big change, isn't it? Pharmacy, law.
It was. I don't think I was content, I think, in pharmacy, and I wanted to change. I wanted to change something which would challenge me. I couldn't see myself for the rest of my working life, professional life, spending as a pharmacist. Law was something I always found very inspiring. I used to spend in London, so I used to go for conferences in London whilst I was in the field of pharmacy, but I would still go to the Old Bailey, spend time there. So that sort of always remained in the background. And then I took the plunge.
That's a big one as well.
Alhamdulillah.
But alhamdulillah, everything happens for a reason. You've been on this journey of law, and hence why you are here today.
Alhamdulillah.
To discuss what I said, that at the heart of the Ummah today, and the heart of the Ummah beats with Palestine. And with the current crisis, especially recently since 7th October, it's come to surface again. And I think the humanity as a whole has been appalled by the handling of the situation. And from Islamic point of view, if I take the lead, there's a reason why it's at the heart of the Ummah. It's so deeply connected with the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have mentioning of it in the Quran. Every word of the Quran is sacred to us. When there are several passages talking about Masjid al-Aqsa throughout the entire Quran, how is it that the Ummah let go or forget our Palestinian brothers and Masjid al-Aqsa? It's connected to almost every Nabi of Allah. On the night of Mi'raj, when the 124,000 stood behind the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how can we let go of such a place? And the Palestinian cause. But what I really wanted to highlight today was, and taking advantage of your legal expertise. Recently, it's become quite clouded. Not many people know where the conflict begins from. Many times we've seen on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and images saying, look, it didn't start on 7th October. It started before that.
Sure.
When did it actually start? So from your understanding, and
look, I think people, so few things that people will say. So they will say this is a very complex issue. If you look at it from the spectacles of the law, it's actually not a complex issue at all. It's actually a very straightforward issue.
Serious?
The legal framework, if you apply it uniformly across the world, is very straightforward. The only question then that remains to be answered is there political will to enforce the law? and the law has to be enforced equally. Otherwise, it's simply some words on a piece of paper. For the law to be upheld, there has to be political will behind it. There has to be the power of the court behind it, and that requires people of understanding, people of goodwill, people of good ethic and morals, to be upright and to be consistent in the application of the law. If I say to you that A, B, C, D will apply if you break a red light, but it doesn't apply to you because you're my friend, then that rule or that law is not worth the piece of paper it's printed on, because it has to apply uniformly to everyone. So if you look at it from a legal spectacle, the law is very simple, the law is easy, the law is straightforward. The applicability of the law should apply uniformly and equally to everyone, and from that perspective it's actually not a complex issue. People say it's a complex issue, in my view, for two reasons. One, because it puts the other side on the back foot. Because as soon as you tell someone in the public, oh, this is really complex, people think, okay, I don't have the knowledge to comment on this.
I don't want to get involved.
I don't want to get involved in this. You will see, people do. I can't deal with this. The second thing that is usually said is that the right to one party to defend itself. The rights exist in law. The right to defense is also a right which exists in law. But that in itself exists within a framework. It's not free from obligation. So if we look at it in the context of the legal framework, things are actually not that difficult to understand. So what I will do is, if you allow me, I will try and set some basic foundations on which we can build this discussion on, and then we will go back to the British Empire, the rule of the British Empire to the 1920, and we'll start from there. I think that's a good starting point, because that, in my view, starts to define and build the building blocks of where we are today. So what we will try and do is build a chain of events
from back to 1920,
from 1920 onwards, and we'll take a step by step, and we can't cover obviously every single event that happened, but we'll cover the major ones, especially from a legal perspective, and then we'll try and build that into a chain so we can connect the dots together and then get a full picture of where we are today. So
Bismillah, go for it. And if I can request the viewers to sit tight, inshallah. Hopefully we'll go through from 1920 up to where we are today,
Yes. I'll try and keep the legal jargon out so it's easy to understand, it's not complex.
Inshallah.
Okay, so there are words that you will hear. So let's try and define what those words are. So for example, occupation. We hear the word occupation. What does occupation mean? Where does it come from? And what flows from occupation of a land? So occupation occurs when one group of people in an armed conflict take over the land belonging to another group. Now, when they take over, that land is an occupied land now. So the occupying force occupies a land, but that itself requires and limited powers of the occupier. So, for example, the person who occupies, or the state which occupies the land of someone else, they do not become sovereign over the land. They cannot claim it as their own. Within the occupied land, they have obligations. They have to, for example, provide security to the occupied people. They have to provide food, shelter, clothing, health, access to justice, the basic necessities. It is the
basic
duty.
Human rights, isn't it?
Yes. So your day-to-day basic necessities have to be provided for by the occupying force.
This definition of yours.
Yes.
Is this? That must. Is it recognized by international law?
Oh yes, of course. So everything I'm telling you is absolutely based and entrenched
within the law,
in international law.
Okay.
So the powers are limited. So if two states fight with each other, one
occupies
the other's land, what they cannot do is
deprive
put their flag on,
yeah, okay,
and say, now I claim this to be mine forever.
Okay.
The use of force is limited within the borders of a state.
Okay.
Anything outside of those borders can only be permitted for under certain conditions for a certain period of time. It cannot be indefinite. So in the same way, when a land is occupied, it cannot be indefinitely occupied. It can only be occupied for a certain period of time. So that, in essence, makes the occupying force, so to speak, a trustee over that land, not the owner, a trustee over that land, and that land still belongs to the people.
Okay.
At the same time, the people who are occupied, they have a right to self-determination. So that's another phrase which you will hear a lot. Okay. The right to self-determination. So, and the third phrase which you will hear a lot is the right to resist occupation.
Yes.
So let's now dissect those two terms.
Okay.
So the right to resist the occupation. So for example, the right to resist the occupation is very closely related to the right of self-determination.
Okay.
So if you think about it practically, again, if we use the same example, two states are fighting, one state takes over the land of the other. The people who are occupied have a right to resist that occupation. Now, if they resist the occupation, what they're trying to enforce is their right of self-determination.
Yep.
So the two work hand in hand. If you say, well, these people are now resisting against my occupation, and therefore I'm going to use more force to overcome that resistance, you're not only undermining their right to resist, but you're also undermining their right to self-determination. Yeah. So all three things work hand in hand. The occupation, the right to resist, and the right to self-determination. So all three work together. As I said, the occupying force has limited powers for a limited period of time, and it cannot be indefinite. So these are the basic principles or the phrases which we will come across repeatedly
throughout the discussion.
Yes. Now, one of the other things I said earlier was that the occupier has a duty to provide security,
necessities,
food, shelter, clothing, health, access to justice. All of these rights are recorded in the Geneva Convention, Article 55 of the Geneva Convention.
Okay.
So the occupier has to provide these rights, and this would then be in line with the Geneva Convention. If the occupier fails to provide these rights, then they are in breach of the Geneva Convention, Article 55.
This convention, for my knowledge, is available online is it open access, yeah?
Absolutely.
So and it applies across the board to every country.
Absolutely.
It's international law, isn't it?
It's international law.
Okay.
If it didn't apply to any particular country or a group of countries.
Okay.
So, for example, if as Europeans we say we are the bastions of human rights.
Okay.
We lead. We were the first ones. Magna Carta and all of that. If we say that we are the bastions of human rights, but we actually don't uphold the human rights ourselves of others, then we have no right to lecture anybody else on applicability of human rights or if there is a breach of human rights.
Fair enough.
The law applies to everyone, and that's where our discussion started from. Otherwise, it's not worth the paper is printed on.
Exactly.
And if the law is not applied uniformly to everyone, very quickly, even if somebody puts a veil, a charade on that I am this and I am this, or we are this and we are this, my country is like this, or our civilization is like this. If the law is not applied uniformly, those veils become, they start to lift. And then you start to see the real picture. And unfortunately, by the time, hopefully, when we're done, they will be the picture will become a lot clearer as to why we are where we are.
The mist will have gone.
Absolutely, and one other thing, within Article 55 of the Geneva Convention, if a force is occupying a land, they also must allow independent humanitarian organizations access for two reasons. One, to supply the occupied people with any necessities, and two, to monitor that the occupying force is actually fulfilling their duties under international law.
I mean, that in itself, within the last 10 minutes, I think we've already established how much of a breach is taking place.
So absolutely, but as I said, by the time we end this conversation, hopefully things become very simple. Very simple.
Okay.
Now, one other fundamental thing that you will hear is displacement. You'll hear the word displacement.
Yep.
What does displacement actually mean? So the part of displacement of a group of people or part of a group of people is covered by Article 49 of the Geneva Convention.
Okay.
Now, Article 49, what that says is that people who may leave as a consequence of conflict have the right to return. Now, again, that's a phrase you will hear, the right to return.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So, for argument's sake, if we take an example of Manchester, God forbid, but if there is a conflict in Manchester, people of Manchester leave Manchester and they go to other areas, they are displaced from their homes, they actually have a right to return to their homes.
After the conflict's over?
Yes. Now, the conflict can never continue indefinitely, which is why I said earlier, the occupying force has a limited period of occupying and they are never sovereign over that land. So if Manchester was occupied, the occupation has to end. The people have the right to return, and that right to return is not limited just to the people who owned the land at the time or the homes at that time. If the war carried on for 10 years and the person who owned that home passed away, their children,
they will inherit the property.
They will inherit the right to return.
Okay.
So the right to return is directly linked to the family. So anybody from that family would have the right to return.
So when we now see, those images of Palestine originally, the map and what it is now.
Yes.
So you're telling me Palestinians by international law have the right to go back to every piece of land that was ever taken from them right now?
Yes. So in the spirit of the law.
In the spirit of the law, yes.
In the spirit of the law, and if you look at it from the perspective of application of international law, yes, every single family has the right to return to their land and their home. One other thing which I think we should also cover here is Article 53 of the Geneva Convention, and that deals with the occupying forces' responsibility not to damage real estate or property belonging to that group. So all of these, if you see, are now linking together, and they form a framework of the occupier and the duties that the occupier owes to the occupied people and the rights of the occupied people. So their rights to resist, their right of self-determination, their right to return to their properties, all of these are linked together. So they are directly linked to each other. What cannot happen is, and what should never happen is, that the right that the occupier now, if somebody occupies a land, a state occupies a piece of land, and they undermine the complete and absolute rights of the occupied people. So again, if for sake of simplicity again, if we take Manchester as an example, God forbid if there's a war, Manchester is occupied, people of Manchester who are not professional military, but they take up arms to resist the occupier. Under international law, the people of Manchester would have the right to resist.
And self-determination.
And self-determination, which is then linked to the resistance. So all of these are within the framework of international law. So these rights are real rights. This is not a pie in the sky when you die. These are real rights in international law, and every country is required to fulfill these rights. So let's now go back to the right of self-determination.
Okay.
So the right of self-determination is a basic right. It's intrinsically present in international law. And what it says is that every people, every people have the right to establish their own state. They decide how they should be governed. They decide who they elect. And that is entrenched in the right of self-determination. And in legal terms, we call that erga omnes. And what that means is that it is a duty of all other states to ensure the right of self-determination is realized.
For this state?
For this state. So let's take Manchester for an example. God forbid there's a war, Manchester is occupied. In fact, the UK is occupied, and people in the UK are resisting. And part of that resistance, as I said earlier, is linked to the right to self-determination. Now, all other states, including the state which occupies, has a legal obligation to ensure that the right of self-determination of the UK at that point under occupation is actually realized at some point. So the occupier can't say, this is mine now, and I am here forever. The occupier...
But the way you've just described it, it sounds so simple and easy. And maybe for the Palestinians, it's almost more like a fantasy. If they were to hear, these really are rights. But if you and I are understanding it so easily, why is the international community failing to do anything about these rights which are part of the law, international law as well?
So if I go back to the beginning of our conversation, I said to you, the letter of the law in a spirit is there. To apply the letter of the law, you require political will and judicial oversight. If you do not have political will, you do not have judicial oversight, you cannot apply the law. Otherwise, as I said earlier, the law as it is written is not worth the paper is printed on. So the rights are entrenched within international law. The rights are present. But for those rights to materialize and for people to actually be able to exercise those rights, the political will has to be present. The judicial oversight has to be present. And as I said earlier, by the time we come to an end, hopefully the picture becomes a lot clearer and simpler. And this is not a complex, situation. It's actually, from a legal perspective,
quite simple. The way you've described it, easy.
It's straightforward.
It makes sense.
Now, the right to return. So we've covered the right of self-determination. It's erga omnes. So it is not just that the occupied people have the right to self-determination. Other nations have an obligation to make sure that they get their right of self-determination. That's what erga omnes means. Okay. Now, the next thing is the right to return. The right to return to their homes, their property. And then again, this is also principally present within international law. And everyone has the right to return to their country of origin, and secure their citizenship. Okay. Again, this is present principally in international law. And the right to return is linked to, if you remember I said earlier, the occupier has an obligation to ensure that they do not destroy real estate and property. So the right to return then links to that. Because
they need somewhere to come back to, don't they? And if that's all been destroyed.
Absolutely. Okay. So all of these things, you see how they start to link together, and the pieces of the jigsaw, they come together. So if we now apply all of this to the Palestinians, what have the Palestinians actually suffered? Now, so we'll go through each and every one of these things. The Palestinians have been denied their right of self-determination.
100%.
The Palestinians have been denied the right to establish their state.
100%.
The Palestinians have been denied their right of citizenship and nationality.
Yep.
Okay. Now let's go back to the First World War. So if you look at the First World War, in the state of Palestine at the time, Palestine as it existed at the time, which was the whole land of Palestine, the Jewish population at that time was about 11%. So 11% of Palestine was the Jewish population, so a minority. Now, in order to establish the Jewish state within the lands of Palestine, it would be very difficult for 11% of people to rule over that. So there had to be changes to the demographics.
Huge changes.
Absolutely. But there had to be changes to the demographics in such a way that the establishment of the state of Israel becomes practical. It materializes. It offers citizenship and nationality. And it provides security to its nationals. Now, keep all of this in mind now. And we'll come back to this in a bit. So, on one side, the effort is being made for the state of Israel to be established, with the initial Jewish population of about 11% in
1920
at the First World War.
Okay.
And the Palestinians now are majority, 89%. The non-Jewish Palestinians, 89%. They now have to be moved in such a way that the demographics change, so the majority become minority. A huge majority becomes a huge minority. So keep that in mind. So everything that happens in a nutshell results in the formation of a Jewish state.
That's where all the efforts are going towards, yeah?
That's where the focus is. Okay. And that is, and then to establish all of this means that you now have to breach all of those core principles of international law that we've just highlighted in, at the beginning of this discussion.
For my knowledge, these international laws, were they present pre-1920 as well?
Yes, so I'll come on to that. So how did it exist at the time? Everything that we're talking about now.
Was it there at that time or not?
So yes, so at the time, everything I cited to you, I said Article 53 of Geneva Convention, Article 55 of the Geneva Convention. But at that time, we didn't have the United Nations.
Okay.
So United Nations, prior to the UN, there was a body called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was established in 1920. It had, if memory serves me right, about 63, member states. And the League of Nations was created at the end of the British colonial existence. So as the British Empire was coming to an end, British Empire was also at that time ruling over Palestine. So as the British Empire is coming to an end in around about 1920, there was, as I said, the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, as is coming to an end, is now paving the way after the British Empire. And there was a league, covenants were drafted. And a covenant in legal terms is a right. So there was an Article 22 League Covenant, which gave the Palestinians the provisional right to self-determination.
Why provisional?
Because because the League of Covenants was a right which would then have to be realized.
Okay.
So Article 22 of the League Covenant in 1920s gave Palestinians the right to self-determination. So that right existed in writing as a covenant, which is a right. So covenant in legal terms means a right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So the easiest way to understand this is you live in a property of yours, or you work in a commercial property. People have covenants and rights over your property. So it's an agreement. It's a binding agreement. So Article 22 gave the Palestinians the provisional inherent right to self-determination.
Okay.
Now that is happening at that time in the 1920s.
This is pre-UN.
This is pre-UN.
Okay.
The UN is the successor of the League of Nations.
League of Nations, okay.
Okay. So and at that time Palestine was classified as a Class A mandate of the British colonial rule, and it was supposed to become an independent state in itself after World War One.
Ah, okay. Now that's new.
So Article 22 of the League of Nations, Article 22 of the League Covenant gave the right to the Palestinians for an independent state, and after World War One, Palestine was supposed to become
an independent
state in its own right.
Okay.
That was promised to the Palestinians by Article 22 of the League Covenant. It was a right which the Palestinians had. So let's park this to one side. Now go back to what I said that at the World War One stage, the population of the Jewish people
11%
was 11%. So on one hand, the Palestinians are promised
their own land,
and on the other hand, you've got
an
11% population, and there is a plan to grow that 11%, so the state of Israel can be established within the Palestinian land,
on their promised land.
So the Palestinians have a right.
I'm following. Yeah.
To their own land,
which
Palestine.
is in principle promised.
Yes, but the land of Palestine existed, right? So it's not something they're creating from new. Palestine existed under British rule. So Article 22 of the League Covenant says that the Palestinians would have the right of self-determination at the end of World War One, after the British rule. But at the same time, in opposition to that,
there's an effort in the background.
There's an effort which is side by side being pushed to establish the state of Israel within Palestine. But the Palestinians are not a party to the other conversation.
Oh, right. Okay.
So on one hand, promises are made to the Palestinians. On the other hand, discussions are taking place to establish the state of Israel without the Palestinians being part of that other discussion.
Okay.
So all of this is happening. Now, the UK and other members of the League of Nations,
there's 60-something.
63.
Yeah.
The UK and other members tried, well, not only tried, but they succeeded in bypassing Article 22. Okay. So they bypassed Article 22 to establish the State of Israel, because the UK had given its promise to the Balfour Declaration to be realized and materialized. So the UK has Article 22 in a covenant with the Palestinians, and the UK and other states bypass Article 22 to establish the State of Israel and commit to the Balfour Declaration. But the Palestinians are not part of that discussion at the time. Now, if you look at it and you simplify it through the lens of the law, where a right exists, if you bypass that right, you're in breach of that law. You're breach of that right. So Article 22 of the League Covenant gives you the right of self-determination to the Palestinian people. The moment you bypass it,
it's a clear breach.
You are in breach of Article 22 of the League Covenant, and it is what we in legal terms say that action is ultra vires, that it is outside legal parameters and it is illegal by its very nature. Okay.
Allah.
Now,
at that time, were there not any efforts made by other nations, other countries to hold them accountable, or raise a flag? I mean, or take them to an international court or something? Were there any efforts made at that time?
No. So you had opposition to the state of Israel being created by the Arab countries at the time, but not from the League of Nations. And if you, again, you have to, I suppose, in a way, if you come away from the spectacle of law now and you look at practically what was happening around the world politically and as far as military might is concerned, it was the end of the Ottoman Empire, and it was the European countries who were stronger in power, and might is right is what prevailed in the end. And there was, I suppose, at that time, the International Criminal Court was not operational with this jurisdiction in the way it does now. So the opposition was from Arab countries, which resulted then perpetual conflict over a number of years. But I want to go back to what I was saying. So legally speaking, as I said, at that time, the creation of the state of Palestine in breach of Article 22 of the League Covenant was ultra vires. So after the Second World War now, so that's what was happening with the first World War. After the Second World War, the right of self-determination of lands which were under colonial rule became part of international law. So the League of Nations had disappeared by then, and the Article 22 of the League Covenant I referred to earlier, that had now taken form into international law. So it had, from being Article 22 of League Covenants, it became international law by then, by the end of World War II. That right under Article 22 didn't just extinguish. It didn't disappear into thin air. That right simply, instead of being known as Article 22 League Covenant, it became international law. So the Palestinians' right of self-determination still is entrenched in international law after the end of World War II.
Makes sense.
So if we apply that, the covenant, the promise, the right simply took another form of international law, but it was still present. It didn't extinguish. The Palestinians didn't say we forego our right. The Palestinians
never give up the land.
No.
Okay.
And they were never part of that conversation, as I said earlier. So we then move on to, I think, the next historic events, I would say, is the 1947 proposal. In 1947, proposals were put on the table after the Balfour Declaration to split the Palestinian land into two to form the State of Israel. And then in 1948, the State of Israel was actually formed. But it didn't just stop there. The State of Israel was not just formed. Now, to give the State of Israel more authority and international power, the State of Israel was admitted as a member of the United Nations at the same time in 1948. So you've got the creation of a state, which now becomes a member of the UN. Now, again, legally speaking, what that means is that Israel now has
been recognized,
the backing of all of the members of the UN, and it is actually recognized. But there is a breach, on the other hand, of the Article 22 League Covenant, and then the right of self-determination in international law. That breach remains to this day. Right. So Palestinians who then remained in the State of Israel became second class immediately, because the State of Israel was created for the Jewish people.
Okay, so this division, from my understanding, was that based on a dense population in a particular area? Like we have the India-Pakistan split, and it was basically, the majority opinion always has been that majority Muslims were on that side, so therefore the lines were drawn in that way. Was there something similar when this split was taking place as well?
No, but if you go back to, as I said earlier, if you go back to World War One,
yep,
the population of the Jewish people was 11%. So by 1948, the Jewish people from other countries migrated
from around Europe
primarily, migrated into Palestine, and they were given Palestinian visas to enter into Palestine at the time.
We've seen those images on social media. Yeah.
Absolutely, you've seen those images.
They've got those passports and documents that we will remain citizens of Palestine and committed to Palestine and all that stuff.
Absolutely.
You've seen it all.
So that's how they
first came.
And I think, again, if you look at history, as I said to you, the right of return, the right to return to someone's own property and land. But when there was migration of the Jewish people into Palestine, they were allowed to migrate even if they didn't have any direct links to the land of Palestine, because the state of Israel was created for the Jewish people. So as soon as the state of Israel gets created, the Palestinians who remain in Palestine, in Israel now, become second class. And those who left were never allowed to return, and to this day the right of return has never materialized,
never been fulfilled.
And this is why, again, you probably have seen this on social media and other places, where a lot of Palestinian families now wear keys around their necks, because that is the key to their home. It's obviously, some of that is symbolic, but some still hold the real original keys in their families from generation to generation. So if we then and that movement of Palestinians, the expulsion of the Palestinians from the state of Israel once it was created, is what we have learned is the Nakba, the catastrophe. And in some historic events, it's mentioned that up to 750,000 or there and thereabouts, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, and they migrated to other parts of Palestine.
Which year was that in?
So that was after the creation of the state of
1948.
Yes.
Okay, we also hear of the 6-Day War.
Yes.
Where does that come in the timeline?
So that's the next event. So the 6-Day War was in 1967.
Okay.
Again, the war in itself was a preemptive strike by Israel. So Israel feared at the time that there would be an imminent attack by Arab countries around.
Okay.
And Israel preemptively attacked, or launched its attack first, and it said
against Palestinians
on their land. Against Arab countries.
Okay.
And it was the state of Israel claimed that it was in self-defense because they feared that they would be attacked, so they attacked first. Now, as a consequence of the 1967 war, Israel captured the remaining 22% of the Palestinian land.
Allah.
So by 1967, the Palestinians only had 22% of the land.
Wow.
And in the 1967 war, Israel captured even that 22% of the land, which included the Gaza Strip, included the West Bank, included East Jerusalem, and if you speak to Palestinians, they call that as the Naksa.
Okay.
So you had the Nakba.
They called Naksa.
This is called a Naksa. Then that again, even if now if so, I gave you the definition of occupation.
Yep.
So if you go back to 1948, when the State of Israel was created, borders were created. So the State of Israel existed with its, borders. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied the whole of Palestine, as I said, even the remaining, 22%. So every bit of Palestine after the creation of the State of Israel is also occupation. So anything outside the borders is occupied, territories, and that's why they're actually called occupied Palestinian, territories, because they were part of the Palestinian, land, which after the 1967 war, Israel took over and took control, and that control was by force.
And it still exists till today, then, isn't it?
Yes. So in one way, shape, or form, now it has now been 57 years since 1967, and that ground reality really hasn't changed. And there is, and you will hear this, and I'm sure many viewers have come across UN reports, interviews with the UN, rapporteurs who talk about racial discrimination, and hence the word apartheid comes into it.
Yep.
So it's been the discrimination against the Palestinian people is because, one, they're Palestinian because of their race, and two, because of their religion, because the State of Israel was created for the Jewish people. So anybody else who were non-Jewish were expelled out of that. So which is again part and parcel of a racial profiling and racial discrimination.
Just for my correction, so after 1967, when there already are two borders,
1948,
the borders have been established. They've also been recognized under UN. Anything that they've done after that is part and parcel and an illegal occupation of the Palestinian lands.
Yes.
And that still stands till today.
It still stands today. So there are in essence two grave breaches of international law. There's the breach of Article 22.
22, yep.
Which was
The
in breach of
land.
that, in breach of the right of self-determination, the State of Israel is created.
Okay.
But the State of Palestine is not created. So the right of self-determination is breached.
Okay.
You then have the 1967 war, and Israel takes over the whole of the land of Palestine and occupies Palestinian territories, not the State of Palestine, because the State of Palestine has never been recognized to this day. The right of self-determination has never actually been realized and materialized to this day. So Israel in 1967 takes over the remainder 22% of the Palestinian lands, which included the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. So now, if you consider East Jerusalem, Israel claimed East Jerusalem as its own. So all the non-Jewish population from East Jerusalem, if you look at it even now, has no citizenship of Israel. So even now, the non-Jewish people who live in East Jerusalem do not have a citizenship to Israel, even though it's under Israeli control. Okay? But the Jewish people who live in East Jerusalem have citizenship to Israel. And hence why, again, the allegations of apartheid and discrimination come into this, because it is all based on whether somebody is of a Jewish religion or not. So these occupied territories are not Israeli territories. These are extra territories which Israel has control over. Because of the 1967 war, which it took control over by force. So in all of this time, Israel has stood in breach of Article 55. So if you remember, I said the right of self-determination is erga omnes. So it's a right which is inherently present, a right which the Palestinians have, and it is a duty upon all of the other states to make sure that they have it. So all of the other states are also in breach for not ensuring that Palestine has the right of the Palestinians have the right.
So that's every country under the UN right now then?
Every country, absolutely. So, whilst all this is happening, in order to change the demographics further, Israel had a policy to push the settlers more and more into Palestinian lands. So more and more settlers went into the Palestinian occupied territories. They started to make homes, started to take over land, and that way pushed the Palestinians further away, further out. And again, this was and always has been, and many UN reports, human rights organizations have said that this has been with the direct backing of the Palestinian authorities, Palestinian army, and the backing of the government as a policy. And again, the consequential result of all of that is that change in demographics, because you are squeezing everyone out from their land. And as you're squeezing them out, you're displacing them, which is a breach of international law. Once you've squeezed them and you've displaced them and you've moved them out, you're not allowing them to return back, which is again a breach of international law. Because you're not allowing them to return, you're not allowing them the right of self-determination. And every time they resist, you say you can't resist, and therefore it's a perpetual cycle of breach of international law, which goes round and round and round in circles, and has been going around in circles for the past 57 years.
Allah. So, Hamad, look, it's been almost an hour now. I think we're just short of a few minutes, and we've still not even got up to 7th of October yet.
So I'll wrap this up quickly, but
go on.
But you understand how
it's completely making sense.
So how simple it is, right? From all of these rights existed from Article 22.
Yep.
They existed all the way through to 1947, 1948. They existed all the way through to 1967. They existed all the way through to the Oslo Accords, Oslo 1 and Oslo 2. And the rights are the same. The right of self-determination, the right of resistance, the right to return. All of these rights are entrenched within international law, which exist, which are very, very simple to understand. So, if you look at the Oslo Accords, I'll cover this very, very quickly.
Yep.
If you look at the Oslo Accords, I think Oslo 1 was in 1993, and then Oslo 2 was in 1995. Now, under the Oslo Accords, and again, I'm going to simplify because it's really simple. The purpose of the Oslo Accords was for the PLO at the time, under Yasser Arafat, to recognize the state of Israel as a state. Although the UN recognized it, but because the Palestinians themselves didn't recognize the state of Israel because they said it was our land, the purpose of Oslo was, or one of the purposes of Oslo was, that PLO would recognize the state of Israel. And the state of Israel, in the end, recognized PLO. So PLO recognizes the whole state of Israel, could be governed by any political party. But Israel only recognizes PLO, but does not recognize the state of Israel. Because the state of Israel still does not exist. There was a number of things which couldn't really be settled at the time. And one of those things which was still in discussion, was up in the air, was the settlements, because the settlements had been built so much and had taken over additional Palestinian land. And Palestinians at the time were being asked to give further concessions on their land.
But where were they going then?
Well, they were being squeezed further and further into smaller areas of land. So they were being asked to give further concessions. Now, again, if you view it in this way, you have an occupying force with one of the strongest militaries in the world, and you have a group of Palestinians without a state, without a army, without any self-defense, really. Now, the occupying power, the state, is saying, we will give you so much of your land as long as you give us further concessions and give more of your land to us, whilst we continue to occupy you, by the way, with power. So this is negotiations under duress.
Allah.
So that in itself, in legal terms, is not really a binding agreement. When you agree to something under duress, legally speaking, it's not a binding agreement. But nevertheless,
it was done.
It was done.
Okay.
So if you simplify it further, it is as if I have my army, I come and take over the whole of your house, and I say to you, I will give you 2 rooms out of your house as long as you agree for me to keep the rest of it. And by the way, I'm standing with my mighty army, and you have no army. Now you may think, okay, I would rather keep 2 rooms than not have any rooms at all. But it is under duress. Whatever I am doing to you at the time is under duress. And that's what the Oslo Accords really were, unfortunately. And they never materialized on the ground because it left so much open in the air. Because it always, again, you go back to the same thing. The right of self-determination, the right to return, the right to security, the right to food, shelter, clothing, all of those rights under the Geneva Convention have never actually materialized. Now, there are 2 or 3 things which are very, very fundamental here, and you probably have heard people discuss this in the media, that the right of self-determination, or the Palestinians have never been given the right to self-determination because they have never been strong enough to form a political party to rule over the state of Palestine. The right of self-determination is not dependent on how much progress those people have made. It is an absolute right, whether they still live in caves and dark ages. But the right is theirs for self-determination. Whoever they choose, however they choose, whether it is by democracy or whether it is a non-democratic state, whatever that is, it is their right. And in any event, whenever you look at democracy or any political movement, it's an evolving process. It evolves. Politics is a process of evolution. Even in the UK, we say we are the oldest democracy in the world. It didn't become as what we see it today overnight. It took years and years and years. So it has to start somewhere. But what you cannot say is that there is a precondition that you must reach this state or this stage of development before you have the right of self-determination. That is never part of the equation. So those are primarily the legal foundations and the background in which all of this should be viewed. Because if you leave that to one side, you leave Article 22 of the League of Nations, you leave the Geneva Convention, you leave all the rights of the occupied people, and you leave the obligations imposed by international law by the occupying on the occupying force. If you leave all of those things to one side, nothing will make sense. But if you follow it from where it started legally to where we are today, it all forms a chain of events, and it all forms the building blocks to where we are today. So then I think the next big event is 2008, when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. But again, the withdrawal was Israel came out of the Gaza Strip but maintained a blockade of the Gaza Strip. So those of you who don't know should go and have a look on Google Maps how the Gaza Strip physically exists. So it has water on one side, which is controlled by the Navy of Israel. You have the borders, which is primarily controlled by Israel. And then it has the Rafah border, which is connected to Egypt, which is also controlled. So nothing moves in and out of the Gaza Strip without the permission of the State of Israel. So now, if we look at where we are today in Gaza, you have so you had already an overpopulated strip of over 2.3 million people in a very small area of land. It was one of the most densely populated areas in the world. I have always said that it is. I don't say it's a prison. I've always said it's a concentration camp, and it's controversial. People say, but the reason I say it's a concentration camp and not a prison is because in prison you're allowed visitors in and out.
And they don't.
The Palestinians are not. They cannot go out. Nobody can come in. Those Palestinians in the West Bank can't go into the Gaza Strip. Those in the Gaza Strip can't go across. In a prison, the prison authorities will give you 3 meals a day. In Gaza, they don't give 3 meals a day. In prison, you'll have access to health facilities. In Gaza, Israel doesn't provide those facilities. In prison, you have a release date. You serve your sentence, you're going to go out at a certain point. In Gaza Strip, you don't have a release date. So that's primarily why I always say it's a concentration camp. Now, the event of the 7th of October happened, which resulted in a loss of civilians in Israel, which I don't think anybody would condone. But what followed after that was unprecedented. It was unprecedented at many levels. Again, if I go back to the definitions I said earlier, the occupying force has the right, has the obligation to provide the occupied people with security, with food, with water, with shelter, with clothing, with access to health, with access to justice. None of that has been provided. In fact, over many weeks and months, we've heard numerous politicians, both Israeli and outside of Israel, saying that food and water would be cut off, which it was cut off and has been cut off. Aid was limited. And again, one of the obligations in Article 55 of the Geneva Convention is that the occupying force must allow humanitarian agencies, independent humanitarian agencies, access to the occupied people. And that's been withdrawn, and we've heard numerous UN rapporteurs speaking openly, and one of the most outspoken ones is Francesca Albanese, who has openly said that there is clear cut, in her view, evidence of genocide being committed against the Palestinians. You now have a situation where people are starving. People have had to eat grass, animal food, and they are running out of that as well. Most recent reports show that I'll come back to this point. But if you go back again, that you had 2.3 million people in the whole of the Strip. They were told to move to the south because the north was going to be bombed, and it was bombed, and a whole 1 million odd people moved to the south, and now the south is being bombed. So now you've got nearly around about 2 million people, or 1.8 million people in the south of Gaza Strip, which was already densely populated. And now can you imagine that that whole population is in such a small area? The spread of the disease is immense. No clean water, no food, access to health is denied. We've heard reports, people are having amputations done without anesthesia. Mothers are having to give birth without anesthesia. Infections will spread very, very quickly. This is unfortunately something in my lifetime this is one of the worst catastrophes that we've ever seen.
Allah. I think we may actually need to come back. I should discuss this in a bit more detail. I think for our viewers as well, they've been sat for over an hour now.
Okay, before you go, I'm going to share just 3 more sentences with you. So since the 7th of October,
okay,
I read, so there is a committee to protect journalists. They released a figure that 96 journalists have been killed since the 7th of October. The Telegraph published an article that 152 UN workers have been killed since 7th of October.
When you say killed, have they been targeted or just in the midst of...
The Telegraph says that they've been killed. The UN workers, obviously we've heard reports from the UN as well that they've happened. Now there needs to be a thorough investigation, independent investigation. There are figures now since 7th of October between 31 and 32,000 people have been killed, and many are buried under the rubble, and we do not know what that figure is. And right now, as things are, you're all aware that South Africa launched a case of genocide, and the ICJ gave a preliminary view that Israel has a case to answer. So right now, all eyes are on the ICJ. What is going to happen with that? And that will be, I think, a big decision of our lifetimes, which could have a huge impact on the landscape itself, not only in Israel Palestine situation, but around the world. And the UN has a role to play. The politicians have a role to play, but as I said, the law exists, but the political will
is not there
to enforce that law internationally must exist. And as I said to you before, if we begin from the 1920 and then we start to put the building blocks in place, come to where we are today, the whales will start to lift and you'll start to see a clearer picture. And unfortunately, this is where we are right now, where I think the lack of political will is now has been open to see for everyone. Every state which talked about human rights, the true picture is now seen by the world. And this case in the ICJ will become a historic case. Either way, whichever way it goes, it will have a huge impact, in my view.
How far does the impact go?
Again, there has to be a process through which the judgment of the ICJ is enforced. So a couple of days ago, there was a UN resolution on a ceasefire. But I was looking yesterday and there was still, bombing going on by Israel in the south, in Rafah itself. The reports are still, coming through for that. So the political will of enforcement, the power to enforce. And the reason I say the political will is still, in my view, missing is because the countries who are providing support and arms to Israel to carry out its ongoing attacks on Palestinians, it is one way of stopping all of that, literally immediately, is to say, no more. We will not give you any more weapons. We will not supply you with anything else until we know the decision of the ICJ. So the rule of law must prevail. Otherwise, humanity as we know it, the international law itself, is at trial now. It is not Palestine, Israel. International law as it exists is at trial.
Jali, Jazakallah viewers, Jazakallah Mabai for your time and your insight. I mean, that's obviously many years of reading and everything that you've just delivered in just over an hour. So Jazakallah for that. For myself, an eye-opener to realise the breaches that have been taking place since 1920 all the way till now. And obviously there's that succession of breaches taking place since then all the way up to where we are right now. And definitely when they say it didn't start on 7th of October, 100% after what we've heard. Jazakallah, Mabai. Inshallah, we'll have you again on the podcast with a different subject.
Inshallah.
But keep sharing, keep liking, and anybody that still makes it sound like it's a complicated subject, I think should be sent this podcast alone just for the breakdown of how easy the law is, and all we're asking for is the rule of law to be upheld.
Absolutely.
Jali. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.